Facing mounting international pressure, will the Israeli government push ahead with its annexation plan with the full backing of the United States? And at what cost? Hello and welcome to Bigger Than Five with me, Rida Fakhri. There's been widespread condemnation of Prime Minister Netanyahu's plans to annex parts of the state of Palestine. The Secretary General of the United Nations has warned that this would constitute, quote, a more serious violation of international law, and he called on the Israeli government to abandon its planned annexation. Meanwhile, more than 1,000 members of European Parliament signed a letter denouncing Israel's plans. Ahead of its July 1st target date, the Netanyahu government is holding talks with the Trump administration on a, quote, gradual annexation. In retaliation, the Palestinian government is threatening to withdraw from all bilateral agreements with Israel. So will Netanyahu follow through on his threat, and what impact will it have on Palestinians? We went to the occupied West Bank to find out.
احنا هون تجمع بدوي تابع للأغوار الشمالية. طبعا هاي المنطقة بسكنها 16 عائلة. قبل ال 67 كانت أكثر من 250 عائلة. بسبب المضايقات للاحتلال لهم وعمليات الهدم وقلة الخدمات تقلص العدد ل 16 عائلة. أنا أسكن هون، أنا ووالدي، عندي 3 أطفال وأنا وزوجتي والوالد والوالدة وبنات 2. أنا جيت بعد الوالد أجى بعد سيدي، يعني هاي الأراضي إلنا، هاي موجودين إحنا قبل 67 قبل ما يجي الاحتلال، يعني إشي متوارث. يعني أنا ولدت هون، أنا عمري 40 سنة، أنا عدد 40 سنة ساكن هون، خلقت هون. يعني أول ما صحيت على الحياة صرت أعيش في الغنم، كبرت صرت أخذ مزارع أزرع أكيد. يعني أنا موجود هون، ما إلي مكان ثاني. استخدمت إسرائيل معنا عدة أسلوب لتهجيرنا من هاي المنطقة. أول شيء عمليات الهدم، قطع المي، قطع الكهرباء عننا. ما فيش جدوى، يعني ما فيش طريقة ما استخدمهاش معنا. إذا في مشكلة مي مش مشكلة، هي كارثة، لأنه هون المي معدومة. بنحاول إنه ندبر أمورنا في تنكات أو صهاريج. الصهريج بيجي 10 كوب، بكلفنا تقريبا 250 شيكل، يعني 25 شيكل للكوب الواحد. للي مزارع أو اللي عنده ثروة حيوانية هذا إشي مكلف جدا، وخاصة في فصل الصيف. شو أنا بجيب في القطارة نقطة، المستوطن عنده حنفية مفتوحة. بدي أقول لك شغلة، ما فيش أصلا وجه مقارنة. أنا لو في عندي مية، هاي الأراضي ما بتضل فاضية، ما بزرعها إشي بعلي، بزرعها خضروات، بس ما فيش مية. مش عارفين، يعني عندهم أساليب جديدة، استخدموا أساليب جديدة، بدهم يهجروا الناس من منطقة الأغوار للاستيلاء عليها. انضمت الأغوار لإسرائيل، مش راح تكون مثلا يصير فيها أحسن من ما يصير في النقب. النقب انضم، شو صار فيه؟ هل خفت الإجراءات الإسرائيلية عليه؟ لا، بالعكس زادت. التدمير موجود، الضرائب انزادت، كل إشي مش راح يكون للأحسن. يعني في ضم الأغوار لإسرائيل مشكلة كبيرة راح يواجهها السكان كامل.
While a majority of Palestinians believe Netanyahu will move ahead with his planned annexation, top Democrats on Capitol Hill, including Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, one of the most staunch supporters of Israel, and Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, have expressed opposition, saying, quote, it puts the future of peace at risk and undermines the U.S.'s national security interests. Meanwhile, a majority of House Republicans have signed a letter endorsing Israel's annexation plans and praising the Trump administration for its so-called Middle East peace plan. For more now on the U.S. position, I'm joined by Robert Malley, President and CEO of the International Crisis Group. Mr. Malley served in the Obama administration as Special Assistant to the President and White House Coordinator for the Middle East. He also served on President Clinton's negotiating team at the 2000 Camp David Summit. Rob Malley, the Israeli government has been flouting international law for decades. There's nothing new there. In fact, there are countless UN Security Council resolutions that were not implemented. When you look at the building of illegal settlements as well, that have grown exponentially since Oslo, is this threat to annex parts of the West Bank all that consequential?
Well, it's a good question, because many Palestinians will tell you that they're living under a de facto annexation, and that, and some of them, I've heard them say, making it de jure if Israel does annex some of these territories will be better, because they could then no longer be able to pretend to the world that the illusion of a two-state solution, the illusion of a peace process, means anything other than a charade. So it is true that at some level, the control of the territories is there. Israel has continued and has not shown over recent years a willingness to withdraw. There will be some real consequences on the ground, and so I don't want to underestimate those. But I do think it's interesting that some Palestinians are saying that they don't mind annexation, and some of Israel's strongest defenders in the US seem more panicked by its prospect than some Palestinians.
But Rob Malley, if it doesn't change all that much, if the Israeli government is annexing territory, so to speak, increasing its settlements, and then the settler population has in fact gone from around 100,000 back in 1993 when Oslo began to over 600,000 today. If it doesn't make a serious difference on the ground, why is Netanyahu trying to push it through now in the last couple of months of this administration?
So first, I don't want to underestimate what it changes. I'm just saying that it may not be as fundamental as some people are saying, because for most Palestinians living in the occupied territories, they would say, what difference does it make? Why is Prime Minister Netanyahu, why does he want to do it? It's a very good question. I think some of his critics, including some who have been traditionally very strong supporters of Israel, are asking that same question. I think for Netanyahu, he sees this as a historic legacy. He will be the Israeli prime minister, already the longest serving prime minister, who will have established one step further, entrenched the reality and the sustainability of Israel's project in the Middle East, and saying, making clear Israel is not going anywhere, and our borders are going to be something that we will make sure are defensible and that protect our interests. And he wants to go down in history as the Israeli leader who took that project, who took that sort of national endeavor a step further. I think it's important for him. As I said, other Israelis are questioning it. Many supporters of Israel question it. But I think deep down he feels this is something that will cement his legacy in a historic way.
But does it also strongly suggest that Netanyahu has concluded that Trump will likely not get a second term?
Not necessarily. I think it might make it more important for him to do it sooner rather than later. Obviously, he's reading the polls as well as all of us are, and he is probably now wondering whether Donald Trump will be reelected. But let's not forget that this was in the works even at a time when President Trump's prospects looked far better than they look today.
But if the Trump administration does endorse this annexation, if it does indeed go through, what are the odds that a Biden administration would rescind it? Because Joe Biden, let's remember, is also a very staunch supporter of Israel. In fact, a few years ago, he said to an Israeli journalist that if he were a Jew, he would be a Zionist. In fact, he said this, he said, if I were a Jew, I'd be a Zionist. I am a Zionist. You don't have to be a Jew to be a Zionist.
Sure, I think Vice President Biden has made no bones about his very strong support for Israel and going back a very long time. And he said it even recently. He has said that he would reverse some of President Trump's decisions. For example, he would reopen a consulate in Jerusalem. He would try, if he could, to reopen a PLO presence in the U.S., restore some of the aid that has been cut to the Palestinians. He has not made clear whether or not he would rescind the recognition of annexation. I don't think he wants to wade into that debate right now. He said he'd oppose annexation. What he would do practically, I think he wants to wait for the day he assumes office, if he does, to make that determination rather than have a fight over something that he knows can be politically fraught. I suspect that it depends a little bit about how far Israel goes in its annexation. If it's a very, very ambitious annexation, 30% of the West Bank, I think it becomes more likely that then President Biden would rescind the recognition.
Well, whether it's ambitious or not could be a matter of semantics as well. There is talk now of the White House speaking with the Israelis about the possibility of a, quote, gradual annexation, but it is still an annexation, which is against international law, isn't it? But having said that, a lot of people looking at this situation say that Netanyahu has been increasingly emboldened by Trump's staunch, blind support for his administration. But isn't the reality, though, that every US administration has turned a blind eye, has given its acquiescence, if not its active support, to Israeli policies, including the Clinton administration under which you served?
So I'm not going to sit here in defense of US policy on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, if only because the verdict is clear. We failed. The Clinton administration failed. The Bush administration failed. The Obama administration failed for the reasons you gave. I mean, the reality is that there is no settlement of the conflict, and things have gotten worse, not better, in the last 2 decades. I do think at the same time you could recognize a difference between the efforts of some past administrations and the policies of this one. Again, you don't have to defend what President Clinton or President Obama did. You don't have to defend everything they did to recognize that President Trump has taken this in a very different direction, basically siding with a different agenda, an agenda that doesn't accept that the Palestinians have rights to a sovereign state. I am not at all, and I've never argued that the U.S. has been even-handed in this file, and I wish we had done things differently. But that said, I think we are in a qualitatively different world in the age of Trump.
But even if that were the case, looking back, though, at some of these previous administrations, the Clinton administration, the Obama administration, President Obama, in fact, made a speech, you'll remember, early in his administration in Cairo, putting essentially a red line in front of any Israeli settlements, but then backing away from it. President Clinton, many would argue, did very little to stop the Israelis from building illegal settlements. How much responsibility do they bear?
Oh, the U.S. has a very considerable responsibility because it did enable policies that have not contributed to the outcome that they said that they were pushing for. I think in the case of President Clinton, he was convinced, and I was part of that team, that we could reach an agreement. I think many of us felt at the time that we could, and so we were sort of putting some of those issues like settlement construction on the back burner, saying if we reach an agreement, all those will be settled. In hindsight,
but is it really a matter of not contributing to the outcome, though, Rob Malley, or does it go further than this? Is it allowing the Israelis to violate international law?
I think the words I used was that the U.S. was an enabler. I think that, and I've said that for years. This is not something I'm saying for the first time. I think the U.S. has enabled Israeli policies that have not been conducive to the outcome that successive U.S. administrations have said that they were pushing for. And we know the reasons, and it's not a mystery. I still think there's a difference between being an effective mediator and being a party that is completely tilted to one side. But you're not going to get an argument from me. And I've said this to Palestinians for years. Don't count on the U.S. stepping in and putting the kind of pressure on Israel that you believe they should put on. There are many reasons why that hasn't happened. Maybe it will change in the years and decades to come, but it has not happened. And I've been very upfront in telling Palestinians and people in the Arab world that's not what the United States, whether it was a Democratic president or Republican president, felt that it could or wanted to do. So there's no doubt about it, and that's why I think the Palestinians should have concluded a long time ago that reliance on the United States as the actor that was going to produce the outcome they wanted was not going to happen. And that's, I'm not defending the U.S. for that, but that's something the Palestinians need to take into account as they make their decisions.
Rob Malley, great to have you on the program. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
While the Trump White House and lawmakers on Capitol Hill continue to weigh the extent of their public endorsement for Palestinians living under occupation, annexation is nothing new. Omar Badar is a Palestinian-American political analyst. He tells us why Israel's move won't affect the reality on the ground.
Israel's plan to annex parts of the West Bank with the support of the Trump administration is categorically illegal under international law because a standard principle of international law is that you cannot take land by force. In the same way that Israel has no right to take parts of France or Italy or the United States, Israel has no claim whatsoever to the Palestinian West Bank, which means that this annexation is land theft, pure and simple. Whatever size the annexation is announced in July, big or small, it will not change the facts on the ground. Israel has already annexed huge parts of the West Bank over many decades, forcing Palestinians to live a life of confinement without basic rights under the complete control of the Israeli military. This is nothing short of apartheid. While Donald Trump is the first American president to fully back Israel's war on Palestinian existence, we cannot ignore that long-standing US policy got us here. Yes, every administration before Trump's opposed Israeli settlement expansion, but their words were never backed up by actions. In fact, for decades they enabled the very annexation that they now claim to oppose, by insisting that Israel be a state above the law that can never be held accountable, and by funding the Israeli military with billions of dollars each year, while that military was entrenching a permanent occupation. Real accountability is the key to peace. Israel has to face consequences for denying Palestinians freedom and equality. And when Israel is finally forced to see Palestinians as equal human beings who are deserving of the same dignity and freedom that Israelis enjoy, that will be the day that we achieve a just and lasting peace.
So just how consequential would Israel's annexation be for the Palestinian leadership and the wider region? Joining me now to discuss this is Diana Boutou, a Palestinian lawyer and activist. She's also a former legal advisor to the Palestinian Authority. Diana Boutou, what would this Israeli move mean for the Palestinian leadership? Will it somehow awaken what seems to be an otherwise lethargic Palestinian Authority?
In some ways, it already has shaken them. We've already seen that the Palestinian Prime Minister has called for an end to all coordination with Israel, which means that they are no longer going to be serving as Israel's security subcontractor. But that being said, this is a little bit too little too late, and the Palestinian Authority should have come up with a different strategy a long time ago. It shouldn't take a declaration of formal apartheid for this leadership to understand that they should have had and devised a different strategy. We've been seeing this apartheid take shape on the ground now for 53 years, 27 of those years while the Palestinian Authority was in place. And so the fact that they have now cut off all ties with Israel is important, but I fear that it's a little bit too little too late.
And should this Palestinian strategy have also entailed a less passive approach toward the Arab states that seem to have really increased their rapprochement with Israel? How much of a strategic mistake has this been for the Palestinian Authority to allow to happen?
Well, the issue of the Arab states is one of their own making, meaning it's the Arab states' own making. It doesn't require for the Palestinians to be pressing the Arab states. And here's where I'm seeing that there's been a great deal of hypocrisy. For example, we know that the people of the Arab world are not at all having any rapprochement with Israel. They don't want to have warm relations. They don't want to have warm ties. If they did, they would have done it 70 years ago with the establishment of the State of Israel and the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. But instead, we see that the people of the Arab world are standing firm and standing alongside justice and demanding that Palestinians be given their freedom. Instead, we see that the leaders of the Arab world, however, are trying to cozy up to Israel, whether it's for their own domestic interests, vis-a-vis Iran, or for other interests, namely security, that we see that this is happening. And here's where the problem is that they can continue to try to take this approach, but what they don't realize is that Israel doesn't care for the Arab world whatsoever. All that Israel wants is to be considered to be legitimate in the eyes of the West, and they will continue to do whatever it is that they want to do, irrespective of any condemnations from the Arab states.
Well, but the Israelis also often argue, as you point out, that many Arab capitals engage in double talk, that they say one thing to them in private, and they make different statements in public. So although it may not be politically consequential for the day-to-day lives of Palestinians living under occupation, how significant is it? And would you expect to see either Egypt or Jordan sever ties with the Israelis if they pushed ahead with this annexation?
I don't expect to see any of that at all. I lost hope a long time ago with the power of these states to be able to do anything. I know that a lot of it is being done for their own domestic interests and not being done for for the issue or the interests of the Arab world as a whole. I think that if they were smart, they would begin to reassess what it means to have relationships with Israel, and they would recognize that these relationships are not pushing them any further. They're not bringing them any benefit. It's quite the opposite. Egypt is in a worse situation than it was before the peace agreement was signed with Israel. Jordan is not in a fantastic situation either. And I think they should start listening to the people that they're supposed to be leading.
Is it not high time for a new, fresh Palestinian leadership, one that could reestablish credibility on the international stage?
Absolutely. We've had the same Palestinian president in office since 2006. He's been in office now for 14 years. He was only elected for a 4-year term. We haven't had elections for a very long time. He's an elderly man and who's just had one strategy, and that is negotiations.
And his term did expire in 2009 as well.
Expired in 2009, exactly. And with the annexation, we see that his platform failed, his strategy failed. It's now time, definitely, for new leadership. At the same time, while it's time for new leadership, it's up to Palestinians to be choosing that leadership. And my fear is that now with this Trump administration, they're the ones who are going to be wanting to choose the leadership rather than the Palestinians.
And looking at a recent poll that was conducted just a few days ago by the Palestine Center for Policy and Survey Research, 81% of Palestinians perceive corruption within the Palestinian Authority, and 58% say they want Abbas to resign.
Yes, this has been consistent for quite some time. We've consistently seen that over the years that there are more and more Palestinians who are demanding that Abbas resign. And it's because there is no vision any longer. It's been a failed leadership and a failed strategy. And it's time to start something new, something different, whether it's the idea of one state and pushing for one state or pushing for sanctions against Israel. The continual policy of just pushing for negotiations has failed, and everybody sees that it's failed except this Palestinian leadership.
Everybody sees, and as you say, there's almost a quasi-consensus today that the two-state solution has been buried. In fact, even the Secretary General of the United Nations, who is otherwise a very prudent Secretary General, told the Security Council recently that the annexation will bury the two-state solution. Do you agree with this?
Absolutely. But I want to be clear, Rida, it's not just the annexation. It's been all of the measures that have been taken leading up to this annexation. So, for 53 years, Israel has de facto, on the ground, annexed the territory. What that means is they've taken land, they've allocated to settlers, they've taken Palestinian water, allocated to settlers, they've ethnically cleansed parts of this area. This has been going on for 53 years. The only difference now is that we see a formal declaration of it. And if we can see that the formal declaration of apartheid is worthy of condemnation, then so too is the informal declaration of apartheid worthy of condemnation. And this is why we have to move away from this fantasy of two states, of a peace process, and instead start holding Israel accountable. That's the only way forward.
But how do you achieve this? Because as you say, even without this annexation, the situation on the ground was such that Palestinians have to ask themselves not just whether the two-state solution is still achievable, but whether it is, in fact, in their interests.
The way that you achieve it is by holding Israel accountable. Look, just in the same way that Russia has faced sanctions over its annexation of Crimea, so too Israel also has to face sanctions for its actions. And if it doesn't, then the message that we're sending to the world is that might is right.
But let's face it, do you expect them to face any sanctions, European or otherwise?
I do. I think that we are now at a place where, given that the mask is off in terms of apartheid, I think that people are really questioning what it is that they should be doing. They should have questioned it 53 years ago, but the fact that they're questioning it now is very important.
But are governments questioning it?
Absolutely. We see that the Europeans are talking about imposing measures. The United Nations is talking about imposing measures. Whether they will or not is not really the keystone issue. The keystone issue is that this discussion, which was once considered a taboo, is now being opened. It was something that even a decade ago, we couldn't even raise the topic without it being shut down. Now it's being embraced as something that needs to be done. The boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement is working, and this is what terrifies Israel.
And you were one of the legal advisors to the Palestinian Authority during some of the years of negotiations that took place here in the United States. Do you believe that Palestinians today should seriously consider the theory advanced by Edward Said decades ago, in fact, at the time of the Oslo Accord, a one-state solution?
Yes, absolutely. I'm a big proponent of the one-state solution. I think that we have to really assess and analyze why there has not been two states. And the reason that there hasn't been two states is because Israel doesn't want to have two states. And I think that what we have to instead start focusing on, rather than drawing a border and drawing a line, is on dismantling Jewish privilege, Jewish supremacy in this country, and instead focus on undoing the harm that these Jewish supremacy laws have entrenched. I think that our focus should be on pushing for an end to apartheid, pushing for one person, one vote, and dismantling the system that we see right now.
Diana Bhutto, a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you, as always. So while Netanyahu continues to weigh his options, he is appealing to an Israeli electorate that has moved increasingly towards the right. He's also hedging his bets in case Trump loses the White House in November, knowing full well that the US president too thinks about appealing to his right-leaning and arguably his most important constituents, evangelical voters who rank US policy towards Israel as a top priority in how they will vote. If Netanyahu does proceed with his scheme, the question is whether any post-Trump US president would rescind US recognition of an annexation that flaunts international law. From me, Rida Fakhri, and the entire team here in Washington, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.